What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the Talk of Fame podcast. I'm Kylie Montini, and joining us today is Eric Christiansen, who's a seven-time Southwestern Emmy Award recipient and is a documentarian whose four films focus on the impact of trauma on individuals, families, and communities. A trauma survivor himself, he lost his home in the Santa Barbara Painted Cave fire disaster. He understands trauma, the resilience of the human spirit, and now how important hope is to heal. And his new film, Unmasked Hope, follows as the disparate group of people whose extraordinary stories of survival most of us have heard only in snippets on the news. I know like a lot of news, like oftentimes I like to air a lot of things too much, and having lived through mass shootings, terror attacks, combat, and sexual assaults, these brave trauma survivors don mask and hide their pain and suffering as they navigate their new existence that is often stimulated by PTSD, physical injury, and emotional turmoil. In order to heal, they must confront what's happening to them and begin their journey through seclusion to inclusion. Eric's story is super inspiring, and I can't wait to learn more about his story. Eric, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. I know that was a super long intro, so I apologize for that.
Every time I hear that, I'm like, I should have that cut down. But yeah, that was great. Thank you, Kylie.
Thank you. I was talking like when I was seeing the intro, I was thinking to myself like, why did I make this so long? Like, I don't know why I made it so long, but it's hey, more than perfect though. Like more the merrier, right? But like, how did kind of the disaster that damaged your home like kind of like an impact on you when it happened?
Now, what kind of impact after losing my home? Is that the question?
Yeah.
It kind of, and I hear this a lot with other survivors, no matter what the trauma is, it kind of sends you into a very kind of limbo land where things are like nothing's really tied down anymore. And it's very disorienting. And, just any sort of trauma, any sort of disaster kind of turns your world upside down. And nothing's the same after that. But like particularly right after the disaster for like about 3 months, you're in shock. And, the people that I've interviewed, it's a commonality between all of them that they're in shock and confused. And it's really hard to find your foundation again. So your foundation and your whole life is kind of dismantled. One of the professionals, mental health professionals in my film, Unmasking Hope, talks about it being a disruption in your life's narrative. Like your life is a story and it's a complete disruption of that narrative.
Yeah, because like when you go through something like that's like traumatizing, like it kind of takes a very long time to get over what exactly happened. Whether it's maybe losing a loved one or sexual assault or losing your home from a disaster or whatever it may be, it does leave a kind of trauma to you for a couple months or even your whole life, depending on like how much it impacted you, because everyone deals with trauma in different ways. But like with dealing with trauma, it does never leave you in a way that never kind of leaves your mind, even though you basically got over that much trauma you did when you first got it.
Exactly. And, there's two things in what you just said, and what you said was 100% true, is, some people, in particular, there was a Korean War veteran, Marine, Purple Heart, that was in my last film, Searching for Home, coming back from war. And he wasn't diagnosed necessarily with PTSD until 50 years after.
Oh,
and he's like, oh, that makes sense. That's why I acted that way. That's why things were like that. And then to the second half of that is that, going back to this idea of that we have this life narrative, our narrative is completely disrupted by the trauma. And we slowly integrate that trauma into our narrative. It becomes part of our life. It doesn't become us. That's something that happens in this process. We kind of become what happened to us. Oh, there's the guy that lost his house. There's the girl that got PTSD in Iraq, or there's a 9/11 survivor, and we move through that to, well, it was very unfortunate, but now it's part of my narrative. It's part of my life now. And how am I? And in the film, we look at how are we going to capitalize it on this? How are we going to make it a positive? How are we going to turn what happened to us into a positive? And that's usually by helping others that are going through the process of trauma earlier in that stage. And there's a great example in the film.
Yeah, like I know it's a film. Like I know, like there's not a ton of films that kind of define trauma people going through. Whether it's like 9/11 attacks or people going to war or serving their country, sexual assault or whatever it may be. Like I know with a lot of people, they're always looking for whatever movies, television series, YouTube videos, you name it, wherever it's out there. And that's right, but there's so many things I can like you can watch nowadays. It's like whatever you look up on YouTube or something, you can find it.
Mm-hmm.
But with like your film, like I did tons of research on the film, and it's like when I did research, I was like, I never seen something like this before. Like it's like it's very rare, especially in 2023, to find kind of movies or even films or shows or series that are kind of this meaningful to people also, to not only them but to the world itself, not only the United States.
Well, thank you so much for seeing that part of it. And that's so important to me that the film is not about the incident. It's not about 9/11, and it's not about necessarily the wartime experience of Sandra Lee, and it's not about the mass shootings. It's about what happens afterwards. But it's not only about what happens afterwards, it's about the hope. And it's about the hope of coming through this. And that's why it's called Unmasking Hope. The center of the film, it's a film about hope. And it is, I hope it is very unique. And I do feel it is unique. And sometimes with distributing this film and getting people to watch it, it's just, it's not the normal film. It's not just like a 9/11 and we see the buildings come down and the people, the trauma after. It's way after, and it's about the hope of rebuilding your life and how that happens. And it's, inevitably when I'm cutting the film and putting the film together, I have a lot about the incident. I have a lot of like stuff about 9/11 happening. I have a lot of stuff about what happened during the mass shooting. And in my first rough cut, that's usually way too much of the film. And a lot of my job is to cut that down so it's just a sliver. And then we're able to tell the story of how people recover. So thank you for seeing that.
Absolutely. And like, how do you kind of like define trauma in a way? Like, is there any specific kind of way you define it?
A lot of people lump trauma in with PTSD. And personally, PTSD is a series of symptoms that combine to create what they call even a disorder. I don't even like calling it a disorder, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And not everybody that has trauma is necessarily going to be diagnosed with PTSD. But trauma, everybody has trauma.
Yeah.
And trauma is a very difficult thing that you go through. And quite often, for a lot of people, the defining thing of trauma is it's one of the worst things that have actually happened to them. Losing a close loved one, all sorts of different, traumas. So that's how I kind of define trauma. And everything is not PTSD, but there is a lot of trauma. We suffer trauma every day at varying different levels. And that's why I tried to say with this film, by mixing up the different traumas, we have mass shooting survivors, 9/11 survivors, sexual trauma survivors, that it's the healing process on the other side is very similar, no matter what the trauma.
Right. And like no matter trauma, like whether it's like losing a loved one or something, I know with me, like I lost my grandma basically about 6 years actually in 10 days. And well, probably this episode will probably be aired by the time like the anniversary is. So, but Like I remember like exactly that day, and I still get trauma from that day. Well, even though it's like, oh, we just get that one phone call and say like, oh, something happened. So it's like when you get that trauma, whether it's like losing a loved one or like going through like an attack or experiencing something that no one should go through, it will stick with you for the rest of your life. And I remember thinking about this actually last night. And I remember thinking, like, what would life be like if she would have been still alive to this day?
Wow.
What would life be like?
I have to say something very interesting that you mentioned, that is, we have to remember trauma is an incident. And I used to call all my films grief recovery films.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma is the incident that happens, and then grief is what happens after that incident. And grief is marked by a feeling for the way things used to be. If we only rewind back before this happened, and that's like one of the earmarks of grief. And so really deep, trauma is such a buzzword right now. I think as a community of people as a whole, we have to learn more about grief recovery and how to honor our grief. And there's several different ways to do that, with memorials and anniversaries and honoring the grief and honoring your grandma. I mean, the anniversary is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
When that anniversary comes up, to honor her is actually part of your healing. It's part of grief recovery. Oh, I remember grandma. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the favorite park or wherever she used to go to. I'm going to spend a minute thinking about her. That's a way of rebuilding your narrative from the trauma of losing her to dealing with the grief of wanting her back and that hurt. One of the things is memorials and anniversaries, and that's how you rebuild that narrative of your life and honor her. And then it becomes easier every year, a little bit easier. But then again, they say grief is like the ocean, right when it
Yeah.
gets calm, another wave hits you. So it's tricky.
It definitely is. And like to go back to kind of like my earlier thing I said, like with everything, like as part of your film, it's unmasking hope. And like how is kind of hope important and stuff like that for your perspective? I know with your film it's like unmasking hope, but like why is it important for like us to use hope in our lives?
Hope is hopefully what we still can hang on to, no matter how far down the ladder we go, no matter how bad we get beat up. It's that tiny little mustard seed of possibility. And so unmasking hope is about finding that little piece of hope. Yeah, it can get better. There's a possibility. When we lose hope, then things get very dark. But Dr. Arya Shalev in my film talks about no matter how far down you go, and he's dealt with so many different trauma survivors, that there's always a spark of hope once you get down to it. And then that's where you can start building on that hope. So hope is literally that tiny little seed that has the potential to grow into something really big. And no matter what's happened to you, no matter your situation, there still is hope.
Mm-hmm.
But when we lose that hope, and that's the struggle, is not to lose that hope. And there's several different ways to do that.
Definitely. And like why was it hard for you to kind of find hope after like losing your home in that tragedy?
Well, the funny thing is, for me, it's not necessarily the losing my home and everything that was the trauma or that really upset me so much. It was what I was doing to myself, because I was drinking and drugging and way more like
Mm-hmm.
like alcoholically and drug addiction and the whole thing. And that really drove me to my knees. And so that's what really affected me most, is what I did to myself. And I kind of traumatized myself. Of course, I wish I could have my house back, but it was more of how I reacted to the trauma and how I reacted to that grief that brought me to my knees. But then at 7 months after I lost my home, that's when I found sobriety and I found a spiritual way of life, and I changed everything. And so without that, over 32 years ago, I wouldn't be around, and there wouldn't be 4 films that I've done about recovery and hope. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, that answers that question definitely. And like, do you think talking about our experiences makes us heal and better with our experiences and getting it out there?
Oh my gosh, that's you're so intuitive. Yes, very, very much. And I think, but you have to find the safe person. You have to find the right person. You have to find a person that what I call can hold space. So let's flip around from the side of the person telling their story to heal to the person that's like listening and being able to like help somebody else. And if to help your relative, or you might know somebody that's been through trauma, that's in deep grief. For me and for what I've experienced, you don't have to say much. You have to learn how to deeply listen and connect with them emotionally. And if the other individual on the other side of that that's telling their story can find the individual that I call it holding space, that can hold this space, that's in a safe place, and you can tell your story, being able to tell your story is immensely healing. And being able to tell somebody else those things that you may not have told anybody else about how you're feeling and think is very helpful. So, remember, going back to the other side of things, all of us can help, our friends and family and loved ones just by learning to listen and holding back judgment.
Yeah.
Uh, but for the individual telling their story, and for the individuals that have been in all my films, when they told their story, it's been immensely healing for them.
Yeah, 100%. Because like when people share their stories, I know from my experience, like when I shared my story with anxiety and depression, like I was so much relieved. I was like, this is probably the best thing I ever done, because I used to like hold back telling people that I went through that, like so much anxiety, depression. Like I dealt with anxiety my whole life, and so did say. So it's like when I used to be held back, never talked about it, never even mentioned anything about it until I started this podcast. Like, what was it, 2 years ago I started this podcast? So like this, like when I started this whole thing, I'm like, okay, well, if I'm doing a podcast, I kind of have to, though. I kind of, I kind of have to bring it up. And sometimes, like, I know, who knows, some people might go through anxiety with this, who listen to this, or some guests might have the same thing. Like,
Oh yeah.
who knows, like, some people might hear and be like, okay, I'm not alone. So it's like, when you feel not that sort of pressure, but that sort of kind of need to kind of speak up and use it and tell people, because who knows, it might help other people talk about it as well and connect with you about that.
It's interesting that you say that, and it brings to mind when I release a film. And I've had premieres where there's, hundreds, thousands of people coming in to see the film. And I remember with my last film, Searching for Home, coming back from where we had a special Veterans Day screening, and it was free, and it was in a big theater, and it was awesome. 6 people showed up. But I've learned, and I am a spiritual man, and I believe in God, and I believe the right people show up. And so for you, Kylie, when you're telling your story, the right people are listening. It may not be thousands of people, but it may be just you're talking to one person, and that's all you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's just Emerson. Uh, Emerson once said that if you just help one person, basically, and I'm totally paraphrasing, if you just Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harvard graduate and philosopher, said if you just help one person, then you've done your deal,
Mm-hmm.
and so I remember that. And it's so funny because I'll be with like some of the my producers and stuff, and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, Eric, it's like I thought we'd sell out, there's only, I'm like, nope, the right people are here.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it reaches one person, if your story reaches one person and makes them go, wow, look, Kylie did a broadcast or a podcast, that's, then you've done your job. And that's what I have to remind myself all the time with my films. because their arduous journey, all of them. It was 4 years with Unmasking Hope, 8 years with Searching for Home. And when I get them done and they're out there, I gotta go just remind myself, the right people are seeing it. The right people have seen it.
Yeah, right. Because like no matter if you get like 100,000 views or how many people are watching this film, like at least there's actually one person watching it.
Hmm.
You might be like, oh, this is not a success, but it might be a success in one person's mind. It might impact one person that's actually watching it. And who knows? That one person will tell all of his friends. So who knows? Like that one person might change everything.
It's interesting because I did another podcast and it was with stroke survivors. And I'm like, what do I have to do with stroke survivors? Turns out they love the movie because they've gone through a similar experience. Their life all of a sudden changed in one day and it was completely out of their hands. And so they love the hope in the movie. And I'm like, wow, who knew that? And that's a God's gift. That's like really a special thing for me when that happens.
It really is. And like, let's talk about the film I'm Asking Hope. It follows a disparate group of people whose stories of survival in which we only hear snippets on the news. Like, why do you think news only shows snippets of their
Well,
story, whether it's like
so,
9/11, Iraq, or whatever it is?
yeah. And unfortunately now, and we all know this, that news is there for ratings and for people to watch. So, the sensationalized version of everything, we hear about the incident all the time. We hear about what was that? Where was the flooding back east? Was it in Philadelphia? Where was that flooding?
Vermont.
Vermont, thank you.
I
Yeah,
think it was I went to said it
there
wrong. I
was
think it
some
was Vermont. Yeah, because I remember my
insane
friend was there
flooding.
a couple weeks ago, so I was like, oh, I think it's probably Vermont.
Yeah, so and incidents like that, and fires, but the insane flooding in Vermont, and we all see the pictures and the guy paddling down Main Street and stuff like that. And then, but in 2 months, when those people, floods are very tough to handle
Mm-hmm.
because your stuff still is there. It's not like a fire; everything's gone, and you're kind of like, okay, well, it's not that easy either. But
Yeah, it's never
floods,
that.
particularly because everything's destroyed, and then you have to go through and rebuild, and it's an arduous, long, wet, gross process. And the healing's very tough on something like that. It's just like everything. It's like trying to salvage everything. So what I'm saying is you're not in 2 months, you're not going to have like a special on the news about how are they doing now, because it's not that interesting to most people. They want to see the
Yeah.
guy. And I got to admit, it's kind of fascinating seeing the guy, you know, stand up paddle boarding down Main Street. But
Yeah.
thing is, it's like it's not that interesting to see. The healing is a long, slow process, and the news cycle just wants to get your attention, and,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just the way it is. I'm not like trying to beat up that anything. It's just the way it is. And so, that's where my films try to serve a purpose, is to take a step back and take the time to see what happens after 9/11, see what happens after a mass shooting, and then also inspire other people that went through trauma.
Mm-hmm. Because who knows, like the film might help other people that are going through the exact same thing for the people you interviewed.
Exactly. And that's why the stroke survivors are so cool. I mean, they didn't go through a mass shooting in 9/11, but they're like very inspired by the film. So that's really,
Mhm. That's great news. And like, how would the survivors react like when you interviewed them? Like, did they kind of like feel kind of bittersweet, or how did it kind of like react when you kind of brought up those memories and talked about it?
well, we have a very particular protocol in how we interview people and how I work with people, and I get to know them very well. It's a very personal thing because they're telling me a very sacred story. So we try to, and I'm very careful about who's on the crew and who's in the room at the time and how everything, the whole energy of the room. And so how they react is like it's a myriad of things. And inevitably, it's a little bit of a relief, but also with a lot of these people, and particularly some of the older veterans, it's a validation of what they went through. Somebody's actually interested in hearing their story. And and that's what it's a big deal to be able to having went through such a gnarly situation. We interviewed a World War II tail gunner years ago, and being able to tell his story and validate what happened to him. And when I hear his story, man, I only have anything but respect.
Yeah.
But it goes back to telling your story. And it goes back to like every old timer you see at your local diner or walking down your street. Everybody has a story. I wish I could just stop so many people I see on the street and go, you know what, sit down and tell me your story. Because like I said before, and like you so aptly pointed out, telling your story is healing. And I just wish I love hearing people's story. If it's
Yeah.
trauma or not, everybody has an amazing story, and
Hmm.
you're building your story now. And I'm sure your parents have an interesting story. And I'm sure your grandma had a great story. And that's why it's so important to spend time with our loved ones and the older ones and share all this stuff and even strangers to reach out to hear their story. But going back, they're inevitably relieved because they've been able to tell the story, but they're also validated that their story is important.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how like most people react is like when they share their story, whether it's like a stranger or whatever it is, like I'm the same way. I would just stop someone on the side of the street or when I'm working and be like, hey, what's your story? What do you have to tell? Like I'm the type of person that loves to learn. I love learning people's stories. And that's the reason why I started this podcast is that like when I talk to people who may or may not know it personally, like it's like whenever I hear someone's story, it's a chance for me to learn, but it's something for people listening to learn, of course, because like these
Yeah.
their experiences might help other people as well and might go push to do something as well. Because my grandfather was funny enough, a World War II veteran, and was a state trooper for years. And I come from a bunch of people, my grandparents, my uncles, my cousins that were in the military. And one of my cousins is currently in the Navy right now, is about to move to Japan in a couple months. So it's
Oh
like,
yeah. Yeah.
and it's like when coming from kind of like a military family, it's like when you hear those type of stories of someone being in the military, it's very overwhelming to hear what they go through because oftentimes when I see my uncle, he was in a war at one time and was like in the military and stuff. And when I see him, like he's the type of person that loves to share his stories about like being in the military and saying all these things. He's very interested in that type of like politics and learning and telling stories about his experiences. So when I see him, I always ask him these type of questions because of course, like you may never have the chance to ask your aunt or uncle or grandma, parent, or someone you're related to or whoever you know those type of questions. You may never have that chance.
Yep.
So like
Yep.
when I see him, I always ask like, "Oh, what was it like?" or how did you feel during that time?" And sometimes I can like if I ask something, I can tell at some point people will probably get annoyed with me for asking so much questions because after doing journalism and podcasts for years, I can get that person that's like I have to all of those journals and questions to bring them out. But it's like I'm the type of person that's always curious into what they have to say, type of thing.
And speaking about the military thing, I just learned that my last film, Searching for Home, Coming Back from War, is now free on YouTube. My
Ooh.
distributor Gravitas has made it free for veterans and everybody. It's been out over 10 years now, but it's very appropriate to what you're talking because it has veterans of all different wars, including the recent Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, and World War II, and Korea, and Vietnam. So it kind of covers everything. But yeah, it's if you just Google "searching for home, coming back from war," it'll come up on YouTube. So
Ooh, perfect. I'll definitely check it out after this interview. And like, how long like was the process like to make the film?
oh my gosh, 4 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, it's just the pandemic was right in the middle of it, so that slowed things
Uh,
down. But it also gave us a little distance from, the first interviews and the start of the thing to the ending of the film, and it really did impact the film in a positive way. But it just takes a long time. I mean, just the editing itself took a year.
Oh.
And because we have so much footage and so many things to go through. My last film before this took 8 years, but we had a long time of funding with that film. But yeah, so inevitably everybody asks me, "What's your next project?" I don't know now because I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to like spend another 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like the like that's what I like hate about filmmaking and stuff is that it takes forever to do. Like it takes so much time and energy, editing, funding. It just takes so much time and energy out of you.
Yeah, and I just honestly, this searching, unmasking hope is, I'm so proud of it because I was able to go back to my roots. When I went to California Institute of the Arts in the 80s, I was able to use dance. I was able to use some great animators. There's animation and dance and all sorts of amazing things, all woven into the story. And so it's a great kind of crown jewel in the four of my grief films. So am I going to do another grief film or am I going to do another trauma film? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know.
Who knows in the future?
I'm
As of
just
right
sitting
now,
here. I'm just sitting here kind of enjoying life right now. And
yeah, just enjoy life right now. Who knows? Things might happen in the future that make you want to do a film like this again. Like as of right now, you
yeah,
just want to enjoy life, but in the future, maybe 2 years from now, who knows? You might want to make another one. So like guys, like you just like at the moment, you just want to sit back and relax and just enjoy it instead of working all the time and doing screenplays and all that stuff. You just kind of want to lay back and just enjoy what's in the moment right now instead of like working so hard and work on something else.
yeah, and I've been blessed with the grandchild and the whole thing. So we have, my wife and I have a lot to do.
Oh yeah, same here. Like my sister is about to have a daughter at the end of September, so that's definitely going to
Oh
be
boy.
definitely crazy. Because she has another kid too. She has my nephew, but having two kids under the age of 3,
Oh
oh,
yeah, I
it's
remember
definitely
that. I
yeah.
have three, but my oldest is 25 now. So
Oh wow, yeah. Like with having two kids and under the age of 3. It's definitely going to be a handful. So I definitely had to go like help out a lot, which I don't mind since I love kids. So I'm like, any chance
awesome.
I get. So I'm like, anytime I go to see kids, I'm probably the happiest person alive. So any chance I get, I'll take it.
That's great.
And I want to thank you so much, Eric, for something coming on and taking the time. It's such a pleasure meeting you, and thank you for everything you're doing. I definitely will check out your films and more information after. And thank you everyone for listening, and make sure to go check out his work. It's definitely terrific and so inspiring. And thank you so much, Eric, for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Kylie, and great questions. Thank you.
Of course, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.